Sarah Martinez had always known she was different from the other kids in her small Texas town. While her classmates played with dolls, she was building model airplanes and dreaming of soaring through the clouds. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, would often find her in the garage, carefully painting the tiny details on her aircraft models with the precision of someone far beyond her 12 years. The town folks whispered about the Martinez girl who wanted to fly helicopters instead of settling down like a proper young woman should. Her high school guidance counselor had gently suggested nursing or teaching as more suitable careers for someone of her gender. But Sarah had her eyes set on something much bigger than what anyone in Millfield, Texas could imagine. When she announced her intention to join the Army and become a helicopter pilot, the reactions were swift and harsh. Her own uncle laughed out loud at the family dinner table, saying that women weren't built for combat flying. Her mother worried constantly about her daughter's safety, while her father remained quietly supportive, remembering his own dreams of flight that had been cut short by a war injury. The local newspaper even ran a small story about Sarah's acceptance into flight school, with a headline that read, "Local girl aims high, maybe too high." The article questioned whether someone from their sleepy town had what it took to handle the intense pressures of military aviation. The writer suggested that while her determination was admirable, the reality of combat flying might prove too much for someone without any military background in her family. Sarah's journey through basic training was nothing short of brutal. She was one of only 3 women in her class of 42 recruits. The physical demands were intense, but she had prepared for that. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the psychological warfare from some of her male counterparts who seemed determined to prove she didn't belong. During weapons training, Sergeant Mitchell would call her out separately, making her repeat exercises that others had passed on the first try. When she excelled, he would increase the difficulty, claiming she needed to be twice as good as her male counterparts to earn respect in the field. Some nights, she would collapse in her bunk, muscles aching and spirit nearly broken, wondering if everyone back home had been right about her limitations. But Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak. Every morning, she would wake up before dawn and run extra laps around the training facility. She studied aircraft manuals until her eyes burned, memorizing every technical specification and emergency procedure. While others complained about the food or the early wake-up calls, Sarah focused on becoming the best pilot she could possibly be. Her first real test came during helicopter flight training. The instructor, Captain Williams, was known for his tough approach and his skeptical attitude toward female pilots. He had trained hundreds of pilots over his 15-year career and had seen only a handful of women make it through the program successfully. On Sarah's first solo flight, Captain Williams sat in the observer seat with his clipboard, taking notes on every small mistake. The helicopter they were flying was a standard training aircraft, nothing like the complex Apache she hoped to pilot someday. But even this smaller machine felt massive and powerful as she lifted off from the training pad. 20 minutes into the flight, Captain Williams instructed her to perform an emergency landing simulation. This was a test that many student pilots failed on their first attempt. The exercise required her to quickly identify a suitable landing spot, communicate her intentions clearly, and bring the aircraft down safely while simulating engine failure. Sarah's heart pounded as she scanned the landscape below. She spotted a clearing near a small lake and began her descent. Her hands were steady on the controls, but inside, her nerves were screaming. She knew that Captain Williams was watching her every move, probably expecting her to panic or make a critical error. The landing was textbook perfect. The helicopter touched down smoothly in the center of the clearing, with no damage to the aircraft or danger to the crew. Captain Williams made a note on his clipboard and simply said, "Adequate," before instructing her to take off again. But Sarah could see something different in his expression. It wasn't the dismissive look she had grown accustomed to. There was a hint of respect, though he clearly wasn't ready to admit it out loud. That small change in his demeanor gave her the confidence boost she needed to continue pushing forward. As she progressed through advanced flight training, Sarah began to stand out for all the right reasons. Her technical knowledge was superior to most of her classmates, and her flying instinct seemed almost natural. She could read weather patterns better than pilots, with twice her experience, and her calm demeanor under pressure impressed even the most skeptical instructors. However, the real challenges were still ahead. The Apache helicopter training program was notoriously difficult, with a failure rate of nearly 40%. These weren't just flying lessons. They were preparation for real combat situations, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The Apache itself was an intimidating machine. Standing nearly 15 feet tall and weighing over 11,000 pounds when fully loaded, it was designed for one purpose: combat. The helicopter could carry up to 16 Hellfire missiles and had a 30mm automatic cannon that could destroy armored vehicles from miles away. When Sarah first climbed into the cockpit of an Apache, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. The array of controls, displays, and weapon systems was overwhelming, even for someone who had studied the manuals extensively. The instructor, Major Rodriguez, was known for his no-nonsense approach to training. He had flown combat missions in 3 different countries and had little patience for pilots who couldn't handle the pressure. Major Rodriguez made his position clear from the beginning. He told Sarah that Apache pilots needed to be aggressive, decisive, and completely fearless in combat situations. He questioned whether someone with her background could develop the killer instinct necessary to succeed in actual warfare. His doubts weren't necessarily based on her gender, but rather on her small-town upbringing and lack of combat experience. The training program was 6 months of intensive instruction that would test every aspect of her flying abilities and mental toughness. She would learn to operate the aircraft's advanced targeting systems, coordinate with ground troops, and engage enemy targets while under fire. The washout rate for Apache training was even higher than regular helicopter pilot training, and Major Rodriguez reminded her of this fact regularly. Sarah graduated from Apache training with honors, but the celebration was short-lived. Within weeks, she received orders for deployment to Afghanistan, where she would join the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade. The reality of actual combat was about to test everything she had learned in training. Her arrival at Forward Operating Base, Chapman, was met with curious stares and whispered conversations. She was the first female Apache pilot many of the soldiers had ever seen, and opinions about her presence ranged from supportive to openly skeptical. The base commander, Colonel Thompson, welcomed her professionally but made it clear that she would need to prove herself quickly in the harsh realities of combat operations. The other pilots in her unit were experienced combat veterans who had been flying missions in Afghanistan for months. They had seen action in some of the most dangerous regions of the country, where Taliban fighters used sophisticated weapons to target American aircraft. These pilots knew that every flight could be their last, and they weren't sure if the new arrival understood the level of danger she was walking into. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the unit's most experienced pilot, was particularly vocal about his concerns. He had lost 2 good friends in helicopter crashes during his previous deployment, and believed that combat flying required a level of aggression that he wasn't sure Sarah possessed. During their first briefing together, he questioned whether she had the stomach for the type of close support missions they regularly flew. Sarah's first few combat missions were relatively routine reconnaissance flights that allowed her to get familiar with the terrain and enemy tactics. She performed well, but these missions didn't involve direct engagement with enemy forces. The real test would come when she was called upon to provide close air support for ground troops under fire. That test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 weeks into her deployment, Sarah was awakened at 2 a.m. by the sound of alarms throughout the base. Intelligence had received reports of a Taliban force moving toward a small outpost where 12 American soldiers were stationed. The outpost was in a remote valley surrounded by mountains, making it virtually impossible to reach by ground vehicles. The weather conditions were terrible. A massive storm system had moved into the region, bringing heavy rain, strong winds, and near-zero visibility. The meteorologist on base recommended grounding all aircraft until the storm passed, which could take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. But the soldiers at the outpost couldn't wait that long. They were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Colonel Thompson called an emergency meeting with his senior pilots. The mission would be extremely dangerous, requiring whoever flew it to navigate through mountain terrain in zero visibility while potentially under enemy fire. The pilot would also need to engage targets in close proximity to friendly forces, requiring precision that would be difficult under normal conditions and nearly impossible in a storm. Lieutenant Morrison volunteered immediately, arguing that his experience made him the logical choice for such a dangerous mission. Two other senior pilots also stepped forward, but Sarah surprised everyone by volunteering as well. The room fell silent as Colonel Thompson considered his options. Major Rodriguez, who had flown in from the main base for a planning meeting, strongly objected to Sarah taking the mission. He argued that while she had shown excellent skills in training and routine flights, this type of mission required combat experience that she simply didn't have. The weather conditions alone would challenge even the most experienced pilots. But Sarah made her case calmly and professionally. She pointed out that her technical knowledge of the Apache's systems was superior to anyone else in the unit, and she had consistently scored highest on instrument flying tests. In weather conditions where visibility was near zero, instrument flying would be more important than combat experience. Colonel Thompson found himself in a difficult position. He knew that choosing Sarah for such a dangerous mission would be controversial. But her argument made sense. Her instrument flying skills were indeed exceptional, and the Apache's advanced avionics systems would be crucial for navigation in the storm. After 30 minutes of heated discussion, Colonel Thompson made his decision. Sarah would take the mission, but Lieutenant Morrison would fly as her co-pilot and weapons officer. This compromise would give her the benefit of his combat experience while utilizing her superior technical skills for navigation and aircraft control. The preparation for the mission was intense. Sarah spent an hour reviewing the terrain maps and identifying potential landing zones near the outpost. She studied weather reports and calculated fuel consumption under various flight scenarios. Every detail had to be perfect because there would be no room for error once they were airborne. As she walked toward the Apache, Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. Some of the ground crew members looked at her with admiration, while others seemed convinced they were watching her walk to her death. The storm was getting worse by the hour, with wind gusts reaching 40 miles per hour and rain falling so hard it was difficult to see more than 50 feet in any direction. Lieutenant Morrison climbed into the front seat of the Apache, which housed the weapons controls and targeting systems. Sarah took her position in the rear seat, where she would handle aircraft control and navigation. As they went through their pre-flight checklist, Morrison made one final comment about the mission. He told Sarah that if she felt overwhelmed at any point during the flight, she should immediately turn control over to him. He had flown similar missions before and knew how quickly situations could turn deadly. Sarah acknowledged his concern, but made it clear that she intended to complete the mission herself. The Apache's engines roared to life, creating a powerful vibration that could be felt throughout the aircraft. Sarah checked all the instruments one final time before lifting off into the storm. Within seconds of leaving the ground, they were completely engulfed in clouds and rain, making visual navigation impossible. The weather was worse than the meteorologists had predicted. Wind shear threatened to slam them into the mountainside, while lightning flashed all around them. The Apache's navigation systems were working perfectly, but Sarah had to constantly adjust her flight path to compensate for the violent weather conditions. 20 minutes into the flight, they received an urgent radio call from the outpost. The Taliban attack had begun, and the American soldiers were taking heavy casualties. Enemy fighters had surrounded the outpost and were moving in for the final assault. Sarah and Morrison had to reach the location within the next 15 minutes, or it would be too late to save anyone. Sarah pushed the Apache through the storm with a determination that surprised even Lieutenant Morrison. The aircraft was being battered by winds that would have forced most pilots to turn back, but she maintained perfect control while navigating through the treacherous mountain terrain. Her instruments were the only things keeping them from flying directly into a mountainside. As they approached the outpost location, Morrison began scanning for enemy positions, using the Apache's thermal imaging system. Through the storm, he could see the heat signatures of multiple fighters surrounding the small American position. The Taliban had brought more forces than intelligence had reported, and the situation was even more desperate than they had initially believed. The outpost itself was barely visible through the storm, just a small cluster of buildings in a valley surrounded by steep ridges. Sarah could hear the voice of the ground commander through her headset, describing their desperate situation. They had been under attack for over an hour and were running critically low on ammunition. Several soldiers had been wounded, and they couldn't hold their position much longer. What made the situation even more challenging was the proximity of enemy fighters to the American positions. Some Taliban forces had moved to within 50 meters of the outpost, making it extremely difficult to engage them without risking friendly casualties. This type of precision targeting required skills that most pilots developed only after years of combat experience. Morrison called out target locations to Sarah, identifying the most immediate threats to the soldiers below. But the storm was making target acquisition nearly impossible. The rain was so heavy that their thermal imaging was partially compromised, and the wind was affecting the accuracy of their weapon systems. Sarah would need to bring the Apache closer to the targets than was normally safe. Against Morrison's strong objections, Sarah descended through the storm until they were flying barely 300 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, they were vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground, but it was the only way to accurately identify and engage the enemy positions. The Apache's rotor wash was so powerful that it was actually helping to clear some of the rain and improve their visibility. Through the cockpit, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions scattered throughout the rocky terrain around the outpost. Morrison began engaging targets with the Apache's 30mm cannon. But the challenging conditions made precise shooting difficult. Sarah had to hold the aircraft steady while compensating for wind gusts that threatened to throw them off course. Suddenly, Morrison spotted a group of Taliban fighters moving toward the outpost's main building where most of the wounded soldiers were located. These fighters were carrying rocket-propelled grenades that could destroy the building and kill everyone inside. They had to be stopped immediately, but they were positioned dangerously close to American forces. Sarah made a split-second decision that demonstrated the flying skills she had developed through years of intensive training. She maneuvered the Apache into a position that allowed Morrison to engage the Taliban fighters while minimizing risk to friendly forces. The maneuver required her to fly the aircraft sideways through the storm while maintaining perfect altitude control. Morrison's cannon fire was devastatingly accurate. The enemy fighters were eliminated before they could use their rocket-propelled grenades against the outpost. But their success had revealed their position to other Taliban forces in the area, who immediately began firing at the Apache with everything they had. Small arms fire began hitting the aircraft, creating metallic pinging sounds that were audible even over the roar of the engines and rotor blades. Sarah felt the Apache shudder as several bullets struck the fuselage, but the aircraft's armor protection kept them flying. She continued maneuvering aggressively to avoid the enemy fire, while Morrison engaged additional targets. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew the Apache through conditions that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilots. She dodged enemy fire while navigating through a storm that was getting progressively worse. Lightning strikes illuminated the valley in brief, dramatic flashes that revealed the scope of the battle below. Morrison was amazed by Sarah's flying abilities under such extreme conditions. She was maintaining precise control of the aircraft while under fire, in zero visibility, and in weather that should have made flying impossible. Her instrument flying skills were allowing her to navigate safely through terrain that she couldn't actually see. By the time they had eliminated the immediate threats around the outpost, Sarah had been flying for over 2 hours in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The Apache had taken multiple hits from enemy fire, but her expert piloting had kept them in the air and mission-capable. The soldiers on the ground were safe, and reinforcements were finally able to reach their position by ground transport. The flight back to base was almost anticlimactic compared to the intensity of the combat mission. The storm was beginning to weaken, and the immediate danger had passed. But Sarah remained focused and professional, ensuring they returned safely despite the damage their aircraft had sustained. When they landed at Forward Operating Base Chapman, a crowd of soldiers and support personnel had gathered to witness their return. Word of the mission had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had flown an Apache through a storm to save American lives. Colonel Thompson was waiting on the tarmac as Sarah shut down the engines. He had monitored the entire mission from the operations center and had heard Morrison's radio reports describing Sarah's extraordinary flying skills. As she climbed out of the aircraft, still wearing her flight helmet and covered in sweat from the intense mission, Thompson approached her with an expression of genuine respect. The base commander told Sarah that her performance during the mission had been exceptional by any standard. Morrison, who had initially doubted her abilities, publicly acknowledged that she had probably saved their lives through her superior flying skills. He admitted that he wouldn't have been able to complete the mission under those conditions. News of Sarah's successful mission spread quickly through military channels. The story of the female Apache pilot who had flown through a storm to save a surrounded outpost became legendary within the aviation community. Senior military officials who had previously questioned women's roles in combat aviation found themselves reconsidering their positions. 6 months later, Sarah was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her heroism during the Storm mission. The award ceremony was attended by several high-ranking military officials who had once been skeptical about female combat pilots. Colonel Thompson, in his speech, noted that Sarah had proven that skill, determination, and courage were far more important than gender in determining a pilot's success. Sarah returned to the United States as a decorated war hero, but she remained humble about her achievements. She continued flying Apache helicopters and eventually became an instructor pilot herself, training the next generation of military aviators. Her story became an inspiration to young women considering military aviation careers, proving that determination and skill could overcome any obstacle. The experts who had once predicted she would fail under pressure had been proven dramatically wrong. Sarah Martinez had not only survived the ultimate test of combat flying, but had excelled beyond anyone's expectations. Her legacy became a testament to the idea that courage and skill know no gender boundaries.